And yes, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient radio on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network, broadcasting live from WPRO AM 630, 99.7 FM. And we believe for the first time ever, broadcasting live on Facebook, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and, of course, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Joining me in studio, a co-host, my brother from another, radio legend, impresario, man about town.
You know, Pat, I just realized we're like the Jay and Silent Bob of the Libertarian Party, except we're both fat.
Yes, of course. We are talking about man at large man, Tony Jones. Tony, welcome back as a founding father of the Coalition, a veritable Thomas Jefferson of local talk radio. How does it feel to be back behind the mic here at the Salty Shack?
It's great to be back. It's great to be back here with you. You know, we were looking through the archives of Coalition Radio, which you can find at coalitionradio.us, and we listened to a podcast from about 2 years ago that we did at a different station, and we are like Miss Cleo. We are psychic. Man, we called the events locally of this week. We called them close to 2 years ago.
Right, and we are actually going to put that up tonight on coalitionradio.us after this show, after you've had a chance to meet and greet our esteemed guest.
That's right. We're heading out for some libations tonight, right?
Adult beverages, alcohol might be a factor. Dominic Ruggiero, if you're out there, we may need you for a beard for our drink stop. Okay. But, Tony, how does this whole Facebook thing work?
Well, you go to facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, and we are streaming there live. So if you've ever wanted to know what Pat Ford looks like, now is your opportunity.
Process servers and all.
It's a great opportunity to, you know, for folks that are on the road or they're heading home or they're in front of the computer. You can go ahead and check out the live stream now on the Facebook page. Now, this is our first time doing it, so it's a little bit of a test, but it's a technology I'm hoping that we can bring to the Coalition to kind of get the word out about different, you know, when you have high-profile guests here.
Right. And getting right down to it, joining us live in studio. Truly, I'll call it the hardest working man in the Libertarian Party, Darryl Perry, candidate for the presidency of the United States and for the nomination of the Libertarian Party. Darryl, welcome to the Coalition, and thank you so much for coming in studio.
Thanks for having me.
No, this is outstanding. Darryl is a fixture, a prominent part of the New Hampshire Libertarian movement. He has spent the better part of the last year or so, we're going to get into all the issues, but the better part of the last year or so campaigning literally, retail campaigning, beyond retail campaigning, door to door across America.
Shaking hands and kissing babies.
Bringing the libertarian message, bringing the true, and folks describe Darryl as a libertarian's libertarian. And what we mean by that is that, like any political movement, there are different flavors, different shades of gray. In this case, about 50 of them. And But clearly, the thinking man's libertarian goes back to really an agovernmental system, a system, as we like to say, my roads, right? where men and women of good spirit look to individual liberty as a fundamental part of their life, as a birthright, not something preordained, not something handed back to them by the government. And truly, over the next hour, we're going to explore things like voluntarism, anarchism, and the roots of the libertarian movement. So let's step back a second, though, and get to know Darryl. Darryl, first of all, how does a young man from the South end up as a libertarian activist in the verdant fields of New Hampshire? Give us your story.
So it's actually quite interesting because I grew up in a church environment, and I used to hear the preachers and the deacons talk about getting back to traditional values. But whenever I would ask for specifics, they never could really explain what they meant. So I decided, okay, I like learning things, so I went out on a bit of a quest to figure out what are traditional values. Like what were things traditionally? You always hear people talk about, the quote unquote good old days. Okay, well, what were the good old days and what was so good about them? And it was around the same time that I came across a documentary that I think was on the History Channel. I'm not entirely positive, but it was about the untold history of drugs in America. And I found out for the first time that, because this is not something they teach you in government school, that drugs were perfectly legal in the United States until the early 1900s. Not only were they legal, but you could purchase cannabis, cocaine, and heroin and morphine out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could also purchase your hypodermic needles from that same catalog and get them delivered to your door. And there was no, documentation that you needed from any doctor or anything. It was, I want this product, here's money, and then you get the things that you wanted. And then it was, a combination of yellow journalism and racism that really brought about the drug war. And so then I started thinking, well, if I've been lied to about this, because, again, growing up in conservative Alabama, you're told, well, this is the law, and the law is good because these things are wrong, and it's always been wrong because it's illegal. If it's illegal, it's wrong. If it's wrong, it's illegal. And then, well, wait a second. These things weren't illegal, 85 years ago at the time. And then I started thinking, if I was lied to about this, what else was I lied to about? So for me, coming to the ideas of liberty and to the conclusion that historically and traditionally, people had a right to do as they pleased as long as they did not cause unjust harm to another person, it was by studying history, not by studying philosophy. And I think that really makes me unique among libertarians, let alone among libertarian activists, because almost every libertarian that I talk to, when I ask, how did you come to the ideas of liberty? Because it's something that interests me, of, what's your story? How did you come to understand this thing that we understand? By and large, I would say about 95% of the time, it was, well, I read this book in high school, or I was recommended this book in college. So it was somebody reading a philosophy book or a fiction book by a philosopher. So, a lot of people read something by Ayn Rand, whether it be Atlas Shrugged, which I'm still convinced nobody's ever actually read the book, but nobody is willing to admit, no, I didn't read it.
You surely can't make it through the movie. It's brutal.
I started reading the book, got to about page 35, realized nothing is happening, and tossed the book across the room.
Can I make a confession? Not only have I read it, but I read it, you ready for this, on a BlackBerry.
Oh, jeez.
That's commitment.
No, that's a lot of driving and a lot of boredom. Most of it was written or read, I should say, at about 75 miles an hour on a variety of interstate highways. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So, a lot of people will, mention either Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead or something else written by Ayn Rand or another, fiction work. I forget the other book that gets cited a good bit. But, it's some form of philosophy that people have read that brought them to the ideas of liberty. And for me, the philosophy came later. And I've actually not read a lot of the supposed giant libertarian philosophers. I have not read Rothbard, and I'm not afraid to admit it. My favorite philosophy book, and I don't know if you could actually call it as such, but it's The Law by Frederick Bastiat. Mm-hmm. Because it's written in such a way as to where it just makes sense. It's a fairly short book. It's as relevant today as it was 160 years ago when it was written. And it's one of those books that I would consider to be sort of an introduction to libertarian philosophy, even though I don't think libertarianism was necessarily really, a philosophy per se at the time. They considered it classic liberalism back in 1848 when Bastiat wrote The Law. But it's a book that definitely I think everybody that's interested in the ideas of liberty should read. Because there were things that Bastiat wrote, again, this was almost 170 years ago. While he did not write the words, taxation is theft, the theory is certainly there because he calls taxation legal plunder. which, that's fancy man speak for taxation is theft.
Mm-hmm. The origins of the movement, and particularly even going back to the days of the founders of the United States, do you think they could have possibly envisioned the point that we're at today in terms of the suppression of individual liberties?
On the one hand, I like to think that while they would be baffled by the lack of liberties that we have, but at the same time, you have to look at some of the horrible things that were done by men that a lot of people would say they're great men, but they did some really horrible things. It wasn't that long after leading a rebellion against taxation that George Washington sent the military after people that were rebelling against one of his taxes. Mm-hmm. It wasn't long after that John Adams instituted or had Congress institute the Alien and Sedition Acts, saying that you cannot speak ill of the President of the United States. You can say whatever bad stuff you want to about the vice president because, Thomas Jefferson's a horrible person. You just can't speak ill against the president, and you can wind up being imprisoned for doing so. And there's actually parts of the Alien and Sedition Acts that are still in effect today, although they're almost never actually implemented or enforced. But, you have to look at some of the stuff that was done early on and then think, well, it's just a matter of degrees.
The question I'm going to set, and I almost don't want an answer right now, the question I want to set the stage for really the final moments of the show, is a reflection of your historical point. We've got three people sitting around the table who are all committed, both in their personal lifestyles and in their personal business dealings and their personal beliefs in the libertarian movement. The question being, of course, is how practical is it? In fact, is it a nation that's ultimately led by men in the 17th century sense, so men or women? Is it possible to have a truly libertarian society if ultimately, at some point, we have to consent to the authority of other people? I want you to think about that for a moment. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. Of course, you're listening to The Coalition on coalitionradio.us, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the World Wide Web, and on the Mighty Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. In studio with me is Tony Jones of RI Free Radio and one of the founding fathers, if you will, of Coalition Radio. And, of course, our very, very special guest, Darryl Perry, Libertarian candidate for the presidency of the United States. DarrylWperry.com. Please stay tuned, and we're going to tackle the big issues.
Now, back to The Coalition with Pat Ford on News Talk 630 and 99.7 FM, WPRO.
And we are back. Coalition, live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network, broadcasting not only on WPRO AM 630, 99.7 FM, but for the first time ever, through the miracle of high technology and Tony Jones, radio impresario, we are broadcasting live on Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, where we're doing our live stream. Joining me in studio, of course, Darryl Perry, Libertarian candidate for the presidency of the United States, DarrylWperry.com. We broke off the conversation at sort of the leading question I want to pose for later in the show, which is, of course, the ability of individuals acting collectively to create a society where individual liberties can be realized while at the same time having to cede some authority to a central government. And we're going to close out with that at the end of the show. Darryl, if bring us up to date on some of the terminology. We'll call this section... We'll call it Libertarianism 101 or Voluntarism 101. Talk to us about how you define the libertarian movement, and then voluntarism, and then, of course, anarchy.
So I'm actually going to go in reverse here, and I'm going to do so because anarchy is probably the easiest term to define because it's made up of Greek parts, an being no, and archy meaning rulers. So when you put those together, it literally means no rulers. And Some people say that anarchy is not possible because you should rule yourself, so it should properly be called autarchy, A-U-T-archy, so, like self-rule. And, I look at that as kind of, in a way, splitting hairs, because when most people talk about anarchy, they mean no coercive rulers, meaning that no one should have authority over you when you are not giving consent, and that's, actual express consent, not this implied consent of, well, you exist within territory that we claim, so therefore that's the consent. Because that's really, how the United States is set up. It's written in the Declaration of Independence that governments exist with the consent of the governed. And most people will say, well, you're within the territory we claim, so therefore that is your consent. Well, no, that's implied consent. That would be akin to saying, well, you're on the receiving end of my punches, so you consent to me beating you up. That's not consent at all. Now, voluntarism is the belief that all human interaction should be 100% consensual and voluntary. And the third term you wanted defined was libertarianism. Mm-hmm. And that would be the belief in libertarian philosophy, which is based upon the non-aggression principle, which is to say that no one has a legitimate right to commit an act of aggression against another person for any reason, and they further cannot delegate that to anyone else for any reason. And I know Tony is a member of the Libertarian Party. I'm not sure if you are as well, Pat. But when we joined the party, we signed a statement saying that I certify that I oppose the use of initiatory force for political or social goals. Mm-hmm. Meaning that I can't come over to your house and tell you, you must do this because otherwise, here's bad things that will happen. Because that would be threatening force for a political or a social goal. The social goal could be, I want your television. The social goal could be, I want you to change the way you do X. And you can't legitimately initiate force against another person for such a reason. You also can't delegate the initiation of that force to another person or group of persons. Meaning that, like me and Tony can't get together and say, well, we voted, so therefore we take your television. That would be illegitimate. If me and Tony say, well, now we're the government of Tony Stan, then, it's equally as illegitimate. Just because you call it a government does not then make the initiation of force or violence legitimate.
Where does Darryl Perry fall in across that spectrum?
I think all three of those terms apply because as far as I am concerned, and I think, the vast majority of others would agree that all voluntarists are libertarians, all anarchists are libertarians, but not all libertarians are voluntarist or anarchist.
Can you throw in minarchist there for a second, too? Where does that fall in?
Minarchist would be what some would refer to as a minimal statist, meaning that they think that there needs to be some coercive government, and there's disagreements on how much. And I think there's good faith arguments that some minarchists are libertarians. There are some people that call themselves minarchists that I don't think they understand what the term actually means, because they're like, well, no, we need a military that's occupying every country around the globe because freedom. And it's like, well, no, you can't have a giant government while claiming that you want a minimal government. Those two things are the complete opposite. So some people that call themselves minarchists are libertarians. Some people that call themselves minarchists don't understand what the term minarchy means.
And, of course, the most hated invective hurled usually at an increasing rate on Facebook, say between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, is, of course, not some obscenity, not some hurled invective or threat, but it's being called a statist.
Ooh.
Oh, all right.
I've actually taken to using the term kneelers. And
Kneelers, okay.
I've adopted the term from Game of Thrones, and I don't know if either one of you watch Game of Thrones, but there's the free folk that live north of the wall that are often called the derogatory term wildlings. And they say, we don't kneel. Mm-hmm. The people south of the wall, they kneel before a king. We don't kneel. So I've taken to calling the people that want government and will actually, defend to the death the fact that, no, we need people to use coercion. I've taken to calling them kneelers because it doesn't sound as bad, and most people don't really know what I'm talking about.
So now, if you were to look at the Libertarian Party, let's just say 2 weeks ago, before you had the talking about Game of Thrones, some invasion of the neocons and the Republicans, in almost
that's been happening for a lot longer than the last 2 weeks.
But we'll call it post-Trump invasion of the pod people. Before that, what is in terms of nationally? What would you say the representative segments of the Libertarian Party are? Is there a way to assign some sort of broad brush percentage to each? I mean, how from the national perspective, how many folks do you feel are truly, I'll call it, voluntarists?
I would say the libertarian wing of the Libertarian Party is one of the, I don't know if smaller factions would be the right term, because I've never really thought of the percentages of, how many people fit into this percentage. Right. But they're definitely, if you look at it as the libertarians, there are definitely a lot fewer of them than there are the other people that will work in concert. The pragmatists, they generally will call themselves pragmatists of, well, we have to water down the message because then we can meet some arbitrary threshold or hopefully we can win an election. And I've been in the party long enough to where I've seen that you don't really get a lot more votes by watering down the message if you get any more votes at all. There have been people run for state rep at various levels and say, well, if I water down the message enough, I can win. And they wind up getting 3 to 5% of the vote. The people that say, I'm going to run the most radical state rep campaign I can, they wind up getting 3 to 5% of the vote. So I don't really see any benefit to watering down the message. I actually see it as more detrimental because then you're not actually promoting what the Libertarian Party stands for. You're promoting some watered down version of it. And that's why the Libertarian Party in a lot of ways winds up getting the label of Republicans that like weed.
Well, okay. So now if you were to, and by the way, on the page promoting the show, and this page will be ported over, as we do on Coalition Radio, with today's podcast sometime in the next day or so. I provided a link to something called the LP Radical Caucus Facebook page, where folks want to learn more and interact directly with the libertarians. They're able to do so without any commitment, without giving out your real name, and still maintaining your place in society at large.
And I would also suggest, Pat, that you put the link up for the actual website for the Libertarian Radical Caucus, which I believe is lpradicalcaucus.org or .com.
Okay. We'll find that out.
Because we just went through, I chaired the platform committee for the caucus, where we have our own platform. And we went through, and it's a completely different arrangement of the planks than how the National Libertarian Party has their platform. That way, if anybody just takes a cursory glance, they can tell this is a completely different document than the National Party's platform. And, there's definitely some work that needs to be done on the platform, but we spent a lot of time on it. It was a 6-month project that we initially thought was probably going to wind up taking 6 weeks. So, there was a lot of work. We went through, started with the 2002 platform, the 2002 national platform, and we rewrote a lot of the planks. We deleted some planks, added in some planks. And we've got something that is the start of an actual libertarian platform.
Right. Now, coming up in just a couple of weeks is the Libertarian National Convention. And for folks who are new to the movement per se. We do not have primaries in most states. We're
There's a couple of states that do,
Right.
but they're non-binding.
Right. So we're at that part in terms of being a nascent political movement where the convention actually means a lot. And
Yes.
in addition to nominating both the president and the vice presidential candidates for the Libertarian Party, and no, they are not cast in stone yet, despite popular wisdom. There is going to be quite the floor fight, if you will.
And they're elected separately from one another.
Exactly. So you've got the chance to really mix and match a number of ideologies within the quote-unquote big tent of the Libertarian movement, but also just as intriguing is going to be in a sense, I'll call it the fight, the rock'em sock'em moments when the Libertarian platform is adopted. You're going to have, unlike, say, the two national parties where the platform is really irrelevant because there really is no belief system.
No, there is a belief system, and I have to, take this time to actually stand up for the Republicans and Democrats. They do have a belief system. There's no principle behind it, but they do have a belief system. And the belief system is, for the Republicans, we're not Democrats. We oppose everything they stand for.
Right.
And the Democrats' belief system is, we're not Republicans. We oppose everything they stand for.
And also, you got to pass it to know what's in it.
Right.
Well, and I have to defend Nancy Pelosi on that as well. And I don't like doing this, but did you ever try reading the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act? There, almost every section, after saying, something, it would say, as prescribed by the Secretary, meaning Secretary of Health and Human Services. So basically, it was 1,000 pages saying the Secretary of Health and Human Services gets to write all of these regulations. So there's no way to have known what the Secretary of Health and Human Services was going to write as the regulation until you pass it and give the Secretary of Health and Human Services the authorization to write the regulation.
So it's kind of like when I go on WebMD and WebMD tells me I'm going to die.
Pretty much.
there you go. Well, we're going to
and then in addition to the platform, there's also the chair election, which is, I would say, equally as important, if not more important, than selecting the presidential nominee, because the chair, after November, the chair is the face of the party for the next 2 years.
Right. And this is, ultimately, in contrast to the two national parties, if you will, the two majors, Democrat and Republican, first of all, as you pointed out, the delegates, I should say, are not bound. All right. So ultimately, it's pure rock'em sock'em, down and dirty on the convention floor.
Think about that for a second. Every single delegate is uncommitted.
Uncommitted.
Up until the moment where they raise their hand and vote.
Right. It's
I'm willing to go on record right now and say that I am most certainly pledged to vote for myself.
Okay. And we were starting a movement to get Tony Jones nominated for the vice presidency of the United States. We're not quite sure where that stands now. We are operating.
I guess we have right up until we end up in Florida, right?
There you go. We're going to take a quick break now. Joining me in studio, of course, on the Coalition, founding father.
Without the powdery wig.
Right. The master of all Rhode Island indie media is, of course, Tony Jones. Very, very special guest in studio. Darryl Perry, candidate for the presidency of the United States and the nomination of the Libertarian Party. DarrylWperry.com. We're live broadcasting this on Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and, of course, CoalitionRadio.us and the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. We're going to get into the meat of the issues and the platform right after this break. Please stay tuned.
Now, back to the Coalition with Pat Ford on News Talk 630 and 99.7 FM, WPRO.
And yes, we are back. The Coalition, live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network, WPRO AM 630, 99.7, broadcasting live on Facebook.com/The to Coalition Radio for the very first time. Joining me in studio, of course, good friend Tony Jones. Tony, welcome back to the Coalition.
Now, if you're watching the stream at facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, part of the reason why we're testing this out today is because this is a technology we want to take with us to the national convention. So if you can't make it down to the convention, be sure to check in on the Facebook page through that whole weekend, that whole period. We'll be streaming different stuff throughout the weekend. So
we'll be periscoping, we'll be Facebooking, we'll be just about everywhere and anywhere. The more inappropriate the spot, the better.
As you said off the air, 2 words, John McAfee.
And folks, by the way, if you have an opportunity this evening and you haven't met a presidential candidate before, and you haven't met an anarchist before, and you haven't met a voluntarist before, and if you haven't met libertarians before, tonight's your opportunity. We're going to be at 7:30. We're going to be at Agave at Hope Street, 805 Hope Street, I believe it is, in Bristol.
Yes, we have the 3 libertarians here that are willing to leave the house.
But not just leave the house, but leave the basement.
That's right. You know, Pat, Darryl came all the way from New Hampshire. We've invited guests that live right down the street to be in studio with us, and they won't show up.
Listen, let me take a minute or two, because we the time flies by so quickly. Talk to us about things like the Free State movement in New Hampshire. Tell Rhode Islanders about that, because what's that commercial where the people's heads pop off and purple smoke pops out?
I wish they would have picked Central Falls.
What is the Free State Project?
So the Free State Project is a movement to get 20,000 people that love the ideas of liberty, or at least, have a very strong liking for the ideas of liberty, to move to New Hampshire to exert the fullest practical effort towards the creation of a society where the maximum role of government is the protection of life, liberty, and justly acquired property. And it's important to note that part of that statement of intent is the maximum role of government, because some people think that there is no role for government. They're welcome. The people that say, well, government should run courts and schools, well, they're welcome as well, as long as they think that's the maximum role that it should be. Protection of life, liberty, and justly acquired property.
Excellent. So let's get right down to your statement of principles. First of all, talk about coercive taxation and voluntary funding.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, talking about Frederick Bastiat in the law, where he called taxation legal plunder. In other words, that was 19th century speak for taxation as theft. And I don't believe that any theft is legitimate, whether it's, being committed by a common criminal on the street or a group of criminals in some legislative body somewhere. No amount of theft should ever be considered to be legitimate. If you want goods and services, then the same way your corner store operates is based on voluntary interaction, to where the person that operates the corner store, they don't come to your house, Pat, and say, give me money, I'll give you groceries, but give me money. That's not how that works. So if you want a good or service, you go find it on, something akin to a free market. And the same could be said about goods and services that are being provided very inefficiently by governments. Now, there's a lot of people that will look at some of my platform and say, well, why do you hate education? I don't hate education at all. I don't like government-run schooling, but I'm a huge fan of education. And point of fact, you could get a basically an Ivy League education for free right now. MIT puts all of their courses online for free. So you can go to MIT and learn anything you want from MIT without paying a dime. So, the thing that we have that is close to a free market is providing education for free. We don't need Bernie Sanders to get elected for people to be able to learn for free. Now, if you want somebody to force other people to pay for you to be able to learn, then, go vote for Bernie or Hillary or Trump or, somebody from one of the two established parties, because that's what they're about, is forcing people to do things.
Talk about self-determination.
Yeah, so I'm a huge advocate for self-determination, meaning that I think that every person or group of people should be able to decide for themselves if and or how they're governed. And some people would look and say, well, that's impossible. You can't do that. But if you look through history, there have been several places where there have been what's referred to as polycentric societies. Poly meaning many, centric meaning centers, and everybody knows what society is. So Ireland is a perfect example to where for a couple thousand years, the various clans of Ireland lived amongst one another, but the governments were not tied to geography. Large area of the Middle East for a large period of time back before and during the life of Prophet Muhammad was a polycentric society, meaning that the Jews and the Christians and the pagans and the Muslims and whatever other religions there were, they lived amongst one another in the same cities and the same towns. But again, the governments and the governance was not tied to geography. So people were able to pick and choose which governing authorities they would voluntarily submit to if they submitted to one at all. But there was no, if you don't like this government, then leave. It was, if you don't like this government, okay, tell us which one you do like.
Immigration.
I am a huge supporter of the rights of free people to cross borders of free countries freely. And if you say, well, there should be this hoop or that hurdle, then obviously you don't have a free country. As far as actual immigration policy, the policy that I like the best that the U.S. has with any country is part of the wet foot, dry foot policy that the U.S. has with Cuba. And that would be the dry foot aspect of wet foot, dry foot, meaning that if someone from Cuba gets to the United States, they are deemed to have dry feet and they wind up getting to stay. It's how my great 13th generation back grandparents came to the United States in Jamestown several years before Plymouth, which was a much more famous settlement, but they just showed up. And that's actually what people did before Ellis Island was ever opened in, I believe, the 1870s. And most people, if you ask about immigration, they're, oh, well, people just came to Ellis Island. Well, no, there were a lot of people that immigrated to the United States long before Ellis Island ever became an immigration point. And in the early days of Ellis Island, there was no take a test or take a medical clearance. It was show up, fill out some paperwork, get your Starbucks name. And I say Starbucks name because they would just, completely misspell stuff. And that's how Trump became Trump and, whatever. But there was no, hoops and hurdles to jump through. It was just come through, write your name on a piece of paper, and okay, you're good. And then there became the various tests. And I visited Ellis Island about a decade ago, and one of the things that was hanging from the ceiling, there was a young woman, I forget what country she came from, but it's largely irrelevant, but she was asked a question during her processing, when washing stairs, do you wash from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top? And her response was, I did not come to America to wash stairs. I came here for opportunity and freedom. And that really should be the way that we look upon immigrants is they're coming here for opportunity and freedom because they don't have it where they're trying to flee. So we should be welcoming. We've got a big statue in New York Harbor that says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. So, that doesn't mean, okay, give me the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses, and I will build a wall around them to prevent them from coming in. No, we should be welcoming to people that want to come here for opportunity and freedom.
Excellent. We're going to take one last quick break, and then we're going to answer the question, if you will. And, of course, that question is ultimately, in a society that is statist, in a society that was formed as a statist state and has progressed exponentially over the past 200-plus odd years, how do we, in effect, practically revert back to a pure form of voluntarism? Folks, you're listening to The Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. Coalition_radio on the Mighty Mighty Twitter. CoalitionRadio.us. Tony Jones, Darryl Perry, Pat Ford in studio, talking liberty. We'll be right back.
Now, back to The Coalition with Pat Ford on News Talk 630 and 99.7 FM WPRO.
And we are back. Darryl Perry in studio with founding father, Tony Jones. Darryl, let's get right to the heart of it. In the year 2016, when masses are flocking, if you will, to the Trump, to the Clinton, who, by the way, really two shades of the same. They're both authoritarian figures. They both represent themselves vaguely in terms of trying to track people's mixed notions, almost like a Rorschach's test of what they really are. They don't represent really anybody except their own self-interest. In a society, in an age, in an era when people are clamoring to be led, to be steered, to be herded, how do we practically implement this sort of voluntarist dream?
Well, one thing that I like to do is tell people that I believe that they're smart enough to lead themselves, because that's not something that they wind up hearing very often, if ever. They always wind up hearing various politicians say, this is how I will lead you, or this is what I will do for you. You don't have to do any of this because I will do it for you, or I will institute a government program to do it for you. And I want people to know that I think they're smart enough to be able to lead their own lives. I don't know what's best for you, Pat. I don't know what's best for you, Tony, and anybody else that's listening. I don't know what's best for you. I know what's best for me, and I'm smart enough to make decisions affecting myself, and you're smart enough to make decisions affecting yourself. So how do we get to this freer society from where we are? Well, that's going to take a lot of rollback, for a lack of a better term. And we could debate, where do you start to roll back? Well, what's the first thing that you cut? What's the second thing that you cut? But the point of my campaign is to promote where we need to be. And there was a debate in Pennsylvania a couple of months ago to where the discussion was, what do you advocate for? And Gary Johnson said, well, imagine that we're currently at A and we want to wind up going to Z. We should be promoting somewhere between those 2 points. And I said, no, we should not be promoting somewhere between those 2 points. We should be promoting, we want to go all the way to Z. If Z is our final destination, we want to go all the way to Z. And I changed that up a little bit in a follow-up debate with somebody else, to where I said, imagine we're driving across the country and we want to go to Los Angeles, and we're starting here in Rhode Island. You don't want to say, yep, we're going to Louisville. Not that there's anything wrong with Louisville, Kentucky. They've got a wonderful microbrew, the Bluegrass Brewing Company. They make an amazing raspberry mead, and I would love to go there and eat their bison brats and have a glass of this mead, but that's not the final destination if we're going to Los Angeles. There are a lot of ways to get to Los Angeles that don't even have you drive anywhere near Louisville, Kentucky. So we should be promoting what we actually want. And then once we get into a position to where we're driving the car, then we figure out what road we're taking.
Where can they find your campaign?
DarrylWPerry.com.
And you accept contributions, cash, and altcoin, right?
Only altcoin and precious metals.
Excellent. Folks, Darryl Perry, someone who clearly takes it personally. We'll see you tonight.